إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلوات الله والسلام عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Alhamdulillah, it brings me great pleasure to begin this series bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, going through this tremendous work or taken from this tremendous work of Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, going through these numerous ahadith that he has gathered pertaining to as-siyam, pertaining to this tremendous act of worship which is fasting. And bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, before we begin and we go into the book itself, يعني Bulugh Al Maram, and the ahadith that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala has gathered from those beautiful statements and actions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in relation to this tremendous act of ibadah, this tremendous act of worship to Allah Azzawajal, that we will begin bi'idhnillahi ta'ala with a very short introduction into the fadl and the virtue of as-sawm, of fasting, in order to, insha'Allah ta'ala, encourage us and entice us to perform and to fulfill and perfect bi'idhnillahi ta'ala this tremendous rukun min arkan al-Islam, this pillar from the pillars of al-Islam. And no doubt, ya ikhwan, that much can be said in relation to the numerous fada'il, the numerous virtues that have come regarding the fast and regarding the reward for the fasting person. But insha'Allah ta'ala, that we will suffice with mentioning just one hadith. We will suffice bi'idhnillahi ta'ala with this one hadith. And this hadith, ya ikhwan, is a miza and a khasisa min khasa'isi. That this hadith is that which is specific to this act of ibadah, and it pertains to that which distinguishes it and separates it from all of the other ibadat, from all of the other acts of worship. And that is the hadith al-Qudsi, hadith al-Qudsi, which is collected by Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala in his Sahih, from the narration of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, قال الله عز وجل, that Allah عز وجل said, كل عمل ابن آدم له إلا الصوم فإنه لي وأنا أجزي به. That Allah عز وجل said in this hadith al-Qudsi, that every single action of the son of Adam is for him, except for the fast. Except for the fast. فَإِنَّهُ لِي, for it is for me. وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ, and I am the one who rewards for it. This hadith, ya ikhwan, in which Ibn Abdul Barr rahimahullah ta'ala said pertaining to it, كفى بقوله إلا الصوم فإنه لي فضلا على صاحبه على سائر العبادات. Ibn Abdul Barr rahimahullah ta'ala said that sufficient is his statement subhanahu wa ta'ala except the fast, for it is for me. Sufficient is the statement of Allah Azzawajal as a virtue upon the one who performs it, meaning the one who fasts, over and above the other acts of worship. That this statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is sufficient as a virtue upon the one who performs it over and above the other acts of worship. And we will look into bi'idhnillahi ta'ala some of the reasons that Ahl al-Ilm have mentioned as to why the fast is distinguished here. Why did Allah Azzawajal attribute the act of fasting to Himself and then say that He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who rewards for it? What is the reason behind this specification and this exception here? So some of Ahl al-Ilm, that they have mentioned some reasons as to why this is. The first reason that they mention, لأنه لا يقع فيه الرياء. لأنه لا يقع فيه الرياء, because showing off does not occur within it. Showing off does not occur within it. فيكون خالصا لله جل وعلا, لأن الإنسان ما من عبادة من العبادات البدنية أو العبادات المالية أو نحو ذلك إلا ويمكن وقوع الرياء في صاحبها بخلاف الصوم. That showing off does not enter into it, because it is something that is done sincerely for Allah Azza wa Jal. Something that is done sincerely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As there is not an act of worship from the various acts of worship of the body, and those acts of worship that involve wealth or the likes thereof, except that the people may enter showing off into it, in opposition to the fast. So the first reason that they mention is that riya and showing off cannot occur in the fast, cannot enter into the fast. And the reason for this, ya ikhwan, is that only the fasting person knows if he is fasting. So it's between him and Allah Azza wa Jal. Whereas the other acts of worship, then he can perform them and show off in them. Whereas with fasting, that no one knows truly if he is fasting except for himself, as he is able to nullify his fast in secrecy. طيب. And some other reasons that they discuss and they mention and they bring is that, secondly, that Allah Azza wa Jal انفرد بعلم مقدار الثواب وتضعيف الحسنات. That Allah Azzawajal, that He singled out Himself with the knowledge of the magnitude of the reward and the multiplication of good deeds. That He subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He ascribed it to Himself, and that He singled out Himself with the knowledge of the true reward of the fast, and how it is multiplied in terms of the good deeds, the hasanat. And that is because there is not an ibadah. We do not find an act of worship إلا وقد جاء ذكر ثوابها, except that its reward has been mentioned. We do not find an act of worship except that its specific reward has been mentioned, in opposition to the fast. So again, this shows the virtue and the way in which the fast is distinguished from the other acts of worship. And some of the ulama likewise bring as a reason for this distinction, and they say that all of the a'mal, all of the actions of Ibn Adam, قد يجري فيها القصاص بينه وبين المظلومين. That all of the actions of the son of Adam are subjected to retribution between him and those who he has oppressed. So we know, for example, that those who have been oppressed, that they will come on Yawm al-Qiyamah and they will seek their retribution. They will seek their retribution, and they will take from the good deeds and the hasanat of the one who has oppressed them. إلا الصيام, except for the fast. Except for the fast. فإنه لا يؤخذ للغرماء يوم القيامة وإنما يدخره الله عز وجل للعامل ويجزيه به. Except for the fast. For those who are seeking the retribution, that they will not be able to take the fast away from that person who has oppressed them on the day of resurrection. That they will not be able to take from the good reward that the fasting one has achieved by way of his fast, that they will not be able to take that away from the one who has oppressed them. And that this is something that Allah Azzawajal has set aside, and that He is the one who recompenses for it. This is what some of the ulama have mentioned. And Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, that he mentions pertaining to this affair, he says, وَمَا ذَاكَ إِلَّا لِأَنَّهُ صَبَّرَ النَّفْسِ ومنعها من شهواتها كما في الحديث يدع طعامه وشرابه وشهوته من أجلي. Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala said, and that is not due to the fact except that he has made himself patient. He has endured himself. He has caused himself to be patient and to prevent himself from his own desires. As is in the hadith, where he said sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he has not abandoned food and drink and desires except for my sake. And then he said rahimahullah ta'ala, وَلِهَذَا قَالَ النَّبِيُّ صلى الله عليه وسلم لمن سأله عن أفضل الأعمال عليك بالصوم عليك بالصوم فإنه لا عدل له. And due to this, the Prophet ﷺ said to the one who asked him about the most virtuous of all actions, that he ﷺ advised him and said, عَلَيْكَ بِالصَّوْمِ, upon you is to fast. فَإِنَّهُ لَا عَدْلَ لَهُ, for it has no similitude. There is nothing that is equal to it. But now, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we will suffice with that short introduction. As much can be said pertaining to the virtues of the fast, and no doubt that we would be mentioning, or we would be here for hours mentioning those fada'il and those virtues that the ulama have brought to us. But inshallah ta'ala, we will suffice with that short introduction in order to keep these lessons very concise and brief. And we will now go into the book itself and the introduction that Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala brings in his tremendous explanation of this book. And we will begin with that which he mentioned pertaining to the word siyam itself. The meaning of the word as-siyam. That we find that the meaning of the word as-siyam in the Arabic language, that it means al-imsak, to refrain from. And this has been mentioned in the statement of Allah Azzawajal, فَقُولِي إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ صَوْمًا فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًّا. In Surah Al-Maryam, there is come in the statement of Allah Azzawajal, so say that I have vowed to Ar-Rahman Sawma. You find the word Sawma, meaning imsakan. I have vowed to Ar-Rahman to refrain, so I will not speak to anyone today. And this is the linguistic meaning here. The word Sawm has been used in its linguistic meaning here in this ayah. As for the meaning in the shara', in the legislation, then we find that the definition of a sawm is firstly التعبد لله عز وجل بالإمساك عن المفطرات من طلوع الفجر إلى غروب الشمس. The siyam in the shara', in the legislation, that it is worshipping Allah Azza wa Jal. This is the first point to mention. There is worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's important that we include this in our definition, as we will come to shortly bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. There is worship of Allah Azza wa Jal bil-imsaki al-mufattirat, by refraining from that which nullifies and invalidates the fast. And again, this is an important point. Rather than just saying to refrain from food and drink, that we are saying to refrain from all of that which breaks the fast. And then we are mentioning a specific time period for it. It occurs between a specific time period, and that is from the entrance of Al-Fajr up until the sun sets. So firstly we mentioned ta'abbud lillahi Azzawajal, that is done out of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this negates the one who fasts out of habit, or he fasts, for example, due to health reasons. So it has to be done out of worship to Allah Azzawajal. And this is what we find throughout all the ta'rifat for the various ibadat, that we find that this part here is included within those definitions, that they are done ta'abbud lillahi Azzawajal, that they are done out of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by refraining from all of that which breaks the fast from the entrance of Al-Fajr up until the setting of the sun. So that's as pertains to the definition. Then he said rahimahullah ta'ala, وَفُرِضَ الصِّيَامِ فِي السَّنَةِ الثَّانِيَةِ مِنَ الْهِجْرَةِ إِجْمَاعًا. That fasting was made an obligation in the second year of the Hijrah, ijma'an, and there's a consensus in this. فصام النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم 9 رمضانات إجماعا. And the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, that he fasted a total of 9 Ramadans. So it was made obligatory in the second year of Hijrah, and he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he fasted a total of 9 Ramadans. And these two issues, that there's ijma', consensus in relation to them. And likewise there's a consensus that fasting Ramadan is fard, yani fardul ayn, that it is an individual obligation. So these are 3 consensus that we have. 3 consensus. The first one being that fasting is an obligation in Ramadan. The second one, that fasting was made an obligation in the second year of the Hijrah. And the third consensus that we have is that the Prophet ﷺ, that he fasted a total of 9 Ramadans. Then he mentions, rahimahullah ta'ala, that the obligation to fast, that it was done in 3 stages. The obligation to fast, that it was done in 3 stages. So firstly, the first stage is that Ashura was made an obligation to fast. That the day of Ashura was made an obligation to fast. That's the first stage. The second stage, that fasting Ramadan was made an obligation على التخيير, يعني for the one who chooses to do so. And then the third stage that fasting Ramadan was made fardul ayn, was made an individual obligation. And that is يعني باختصار, mentioning those 3 stages briefly and in summary. And then he discusses rahimahullah ta'ala the hikmah and the wisdom behind this. Then what is the wisdom behind legislating the fasting of Ramadan in 3 stages? So he says rahimahullah that the wisdom pertaining to that is that within the fast that we find that there is nur' mushaqqah ala nufus, that there is a type of difficulty and burden upon the souls. فَتَدَرَّجَ التَّشْرِيعُ شَيْئًا فَشَيْئًا. So it was legislated in stages, bit by bit. لأن كل شيء يشق على النفوس فالله عز وجل بحكمته ورحمته يلزم العباد به شيئا فشيئا. Because everything that causes somewhat of a difficulty and burden upon the souls, then from Allah Azza wa Jal, from His hikmah and from His mercy, is that He obligates it upon the servants bit by bit. Just like, for example, we find the prohibition of khamar, the prohibition of alcohol, that He was done likewise in stages. And other than that, from those various examples whereby the ruling for them came in various stages. And this is all from the hikmah, from the wisdom of Allah Azza wa Jal, and from His mercy bina. طيب. Now moving on bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, that we will mention some of the hikam, some of the wisdoms behind the fast itself. Then what are the wisdoms behind fasting? And we will mention them bi'idhnillahi ta'ala على وجه الاختصار, in a concise manner, in order to keep these lessons brief bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So the first hikmah, the first wisdom that he mentions rahimahullah ta'ala, that he says أولها وأهمها التقوى, that the first of it and the most important of them is التقوى, and that is which Allah Azza wa Jal mentioned when He said يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. Or you believe that fasting has been prescribed upon you, just as it was prescribed upon those who came before you, in order that you may obtain at-taqwa. So that's the first hikmah. The second one, the second wisdom behind the fast is معرفة قدر نعمة الله على العباد, is knowing the extent of the blessing of Allah Azza wa Jal upon His servants. بتناول ما يشتهيه من الأكل والشرب والنكاح, by way of consuming that which they desire, by way of eating and drinking and marrying. لأن قدر النعم لا يعرف إلا بضدها, because the extent of the blessing is not known except by experiencing the direct opposite of it. Again, the extent of the blessings of Allah Azza wa Jal that is not known, is not comprehended in truth, except by experiencing the direct opposite to them. So when the servant fasts and he abandons that which he desires by way of eating and drinking, then he truly appreciates the ni'mah and the blessing that Allah Azza wa Jal has given him. by way of allowing him to be able to eat and to drink and other than that. Thirdly, the third wisdom that he mentions, تعويد النفس على الصبر والتحمل. That one accustoms his soul upon having patience and forbearance. Fourthly, the fourth wisdom that he mentions, أن الغني يعرف حاجة الفقير فيرق له ويرحمه. That the rich person, that he realizes and acknowledges the need for the poor person, so he shows compassion to him and he has mercy towards him. The fifth one, أن فيه تضييقا لمجاري الشيطان. That within it is a restriction from the pathways of the Shaytan. And he goes on to explain, because when the fasting person that he fasts, that his veins, that they become restricted. So therefore the Shaytan has no pathways to flow through him. As has been mentioned in the hadith, where he said sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, الشيطان يجري من ابن آدم مجرى الدم. That the Shaytan flows through the son of Adam the way that the blood flows through him. The sixth one that we will mention, أن الغالب على الصائمين التفرغ للعبادة. That the fasting ones, that when they are fasting, that they have more time to devote to the worship of Allah Azzawajal. And this is why that you find that a person, when he is fasting, that he increases in his ibadah. And that the day in which he fasts is not like the day in which he is not fasting. That there is a difference between the two. That the day in which he is fasting is the day in which he devotes himself for the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he mentioned other reasons, rahimahullah ta'ala, but in order to keep it concise and brief, that we will suffice with what we have mentioned, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And going forward now, as we go into the book, then bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we aim to keep these lessons very short, within half an hour time span, and to take just a couple of hadith at a time and go through some of the or a brief explanation of the hadith, along with the masail fiqhiyah, along with the rulings, the fiqh rulings that the hadith that can be extracted from the hadith, and likewise some of the fawaid and some of the benefits that are to be taken from the hadith, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. ونكتفي بهذا وصلى اللهم وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين.